There are stories that Rome tells with pride of triumphs, of builders, of emperors crowned in laurel and wrapped in marble. But then, there are the ones whispered, not carved. The stories not etched into arches or recited in oaths. The stories of the madmen, of men who wore the purple not with dignity but with delusion. Men whose crowns tilted not from the weight of duty, but from the shifting tremors of their own minds. It begins not with one man, but with a city that believed itself eternal. Rome, that roaring lion of stone and law, had tamed the world but not itself. Power, once absolute, does not always seek the wise. Sometimes it finds the broken. Sometimes it rewards the theatrical. And sometimes it creates monsters simply by making men believe they are gods. The first name spoken in such hush was Tiberius. He did not begin mad. No one ever does. He was cautious, scholarly, reluctant. But Rome, in all its hunger for strength, demands more than rule. It demands spectacle. And Tiberius refused to dance. He ruled not from the forum, but from shadows, from islands, from exile he chose. He withdrew to Capri, a palace perched above cliffs, far from the Senate, far from the people, and eventually, far from the edge of sanity. There, beyond the reach of Rome's eyes. Tiberius let his inner silence grow teeth. The halls of Capri became strange, lit by torchlight, lined with mirrors, perfumed with incense, stained with rumors. Servants spoke of boys trained to swim between his legs, of men thrown from cliffs for disobedience, of nightly rituals no historian dared describe in full. And when reports reached Rome, they came not with screams, but with silence, because fear was faster than truth. When Tiberius died, the people rejoiced, not for freedom, but because the silence had ended, or so they thought. What came next was not relief. It was Caligula, born Gaius, called Little Boots by the soldiers of his father. Caligula was Rome's first taste of madness clothed in charm. When he took power, they cheered. He looked the part. Young, sharp-eyed, graceful, he gave bonuses to the guard, freed the wrongfully accused, hosted games, reopened temples. For a brief moment, Rome felt alive again. Then the fever came, not a metaphor, an actual illness. Caligula fell sick, nearly died, and when he awoke, the world had shifted. The laughter became strained, the decrees more erratic. He declared himself a god not metaphorically, but with shrines, with incense, with sacrifices made to his own reflection. He dressed as Venus one day, Mars the next. He spoke to the moon. He built a stable of gold for his horse and threatened to make it a consul. And beneath it all, a quiet terror spread, because while madness can amuse, it also kills. Senators disappeared. Governors were executed for dreaming wrongly. People learned to applaud when he laughed and cry when he wept, regardless of what they felt. One day, he declared war on Neptune, god of the sea, and marched troops to the shore where they stabbed the waves and collected seashells as spoils of victory. And Rome obeyed, because when power has no mirror, it believes itself beautiful. Caligula ruled like a fevered god for 4 years. Then, in the corridors beneath the theater, they ended him, not with poetry, with knives, brutally, quickly. But the memory remained, and the fear it carved stayed in the bones of the empire, because after Caligula, Rome learned madness, once welcomed, never truly leaves. It merely changes its mask. They found him trembling behind a curtain, hidden in the palace, forgotten like a ghost who had survived too long. Claudius, The uncle no one noticed. The man with the stammer, the limp, the scholar's eyes and the coward's posture when the assassins fled, and the guards searched for a name to lift onto the throne. They found him cowering, not demanding, and yet somehow, when he stood, Rome listened. Claudius was no madman, not at first. He was cautious, curious, buried in books and histories. He rebuilt what others had burned. He repaired aqueducts, expanded the empire, and filled the Senate once more with a sense of duty. But Rome does not forget the scent of madness. It lingers. And though Claudius ruled with reason, his household was built on betrayal. His wives did not love him. His children did not trust him. The palace he walked each morning was quieter than Caligula's, but not safer. Messalina, his empress, began as a whisper and ended as a warning. She played the devoted wife by day and the predator by night. They said she competed with prostitutes to see who could take the most lovers in a single evening, that she wed another man in secret, while Claudius feasted elsewhere, that her ambition was as wide as her smile and sharper than any senator's dagger. When the betrayal surfaced, Claudius wept not with rage but with confusion, and when she was executed, the Senate watched his eyes for any sign of sorrow. They found only silence, but silence, in Rome, is never empty. Years passed. Another wife came, Agrippina, cunning, poised, relentless. She brought with her a boy Nero, and slowly, with the gentleness of poison, she moved Claudius toward death. They say he was served mushrooms that night, the favorite dish, the fatal dish. He died as he had lived underestimated. The empire passed to Nero, and with it, the bloodline of Augustus ended. A new chapter began, not written in law or marble, but in fire and verse. Nero, the boy emperor, the artist in a crown, the actor with an army. He came to power with promises of reform, of liberty, of light. But Rome knew better than to trust first acts. At first, he danced for the people quite literally. He sang, played lyre, recited poetry. He wore silk in public, kissed actors in the forum, painted himself in the colors of Dionysus. They laughed, then they whispered, then they watched, because Rome had seen charm curdle before. It always starts with music. Then comes the fire. And one day, it did. The city burned for 9 days and nights. Flames devoured markets, temples, homes, ash filled the Tiber, smoke darkened the sky, and while Rome choked, Nero performed. That was the story they told, that he stood on a private stage, dressed in robes of myth, singing of the fall of Troy as real fire devoured his own people. Whether true or not, it did not matter. Belief is stronger than fact in a city that runs on legend. And when the flames died, and the people begged for answers, Nero found them, Christians, new, strange, unloved, convenient. He blamed them, tortured them, burned them alive by night in the gardens of his palace as living torches. And the people, hungry for justice, applauded, because madness, when paired with direction, is called leadership, and Nero understood that to survive. A madman must always find an enemy more frightening than himself. He began to believe the applause. That was his curse, not the vanity, not the theater, not even the cruelty, but the belief that every cheer was love, that every silence was betrayal. Nero did not merely rule Rome, he performed it, and the empire. Weary yet dazzled, played along. He built a palace the size of a city, with gold ceilings and scented fountains. He invited thousands to feast beneath paintings of gods that resembled only him. He raced chariots, sang epics, demanded standing ovations at midnight. But the stage, once a refuge, turned into a prison. He could not stop, not even when whispers turned to laughter, not when generals grew quiet, not when his mother, Agrippina, began to doubt him. She had birthed him for this crown, carved his path from the bones of Claudius. But now, she too became a threat. He invited her aboard a boat designed to collapse, a gift cloaked in warmth. When the trap failed and she swam ashore, he ordered her death directly, brutally. They say her last words were not a curse, but a command: strike the womb that bore him. After that, Nero smiled less. He slept with guards at his door, food tasters by his side, and dreams haunted by family ghosts. His paranoia grew vines, curling into every corner of the palace, one by one. His tutors, his allies, his wives, vanished. Seneca, the philosopher who once guided him with patience, was forced to open his own veins in silence. Octavia, his first wife, accused of adultery, exiled, then executed. Her head sent as a gift to his mistress. Each betrayal, real or imagined, fed a fire in him that no song could quiet. And Rome watched. They always watched. But now, they began to count. Grain shipments grew scarce. Taxes rose. The treasury emptied. And in the streets, statues of Nero no longer wore garlands, but graffiti. The Senate grew restless. Generals, far from the capital, whispered of rebellion. The man who had played the lyre now trembled when horses approached. In the end, it was not daggers that undid him, but silence. Galba, a governor in Hispania, was declared emperor by his own troops. Rome did not resist. Nero fled the city in disguise, barefoot, wrapped in an old cloak, clutching a box of poison. He hid in the villa of a freedman, trembling, weeping, begging for anyone to kill him. But no one moved, so he took the knife himself, and in that quiet moment, before the blade struck, he asked the question that has echoed for centuries, the last words of the man who burned Rome and worshipped himself: what an artist dies in me. The artist did die, but the madness did not. It remained not in Nero's body, but in the bones of the empire. Because Rome, once ruled by laws and lictors, had tasted something darker, and darker things were coming. They thought the madness had died with him, that the artist's final breath would cleanse the marble and silence the fire. But Rome had already changed. The throne, once gilded with discipline and duty, now trembled beneath the weight of ghosts. The year of the 4 emperors followed a chaotic carousel of blood, betrayal, and ambition, but none of those brief flames burned long enough to leave scars. It was when calm returned, under the dynasty of the Flavians and later the Antonines, that the shadows grew quiet again. For a time, then came Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the Stoic emperor, the last of Rome's truly virtuous rulers. And what irony that from such noble wisdom came such monstrous indulgence. Commodus did not inherit his father's mind. He inherited the empire like a child inherits a toy entitled careless, dangerous. He believed himself a living god, not in theory but in costume. He dressed as Hercules, wore lion skins over royal robes, and carried a club instead of a scepter. He renamed the months after himself. Even the legions, the city, the empire, all commodian now. He bathed in perfumes, demanded statues in every temple, and fought in the arena not once, but hundreds of times, slaying animals and men alike, not as emperor but as spectacle. The people applauded because they were afraid. The Senate bowed because it had no choice, and those who whispered in corridors spoke only in the language of exits and poison. He killed freely those he distrusted, those who displeased, those who reminded him of his father, and in the quiet of his palace. He watched the world bend beneath him, believing himself eternal. But no madness lasts forever. His mistress plotted with his wrestling trainer. One strangled him while the other looked away. The emperor died not on the battlefield, nor in the Senate, but in a bathhouse, choking on delusion. Yet his death did not cure the illness. It only taught it how to change shape. Years passed. Names shifted, thrones turned. Then, from the east, came a boy wrapped in silk and shadow, Elagabalus, a name that still burns in the memory of Rome like incense on spoiled air. He was crowned as a god before he was a man, a priest of a foreign sun cult, dragged to power by his mother's ambition and a legion's confusion. He brought with him a black meteorite sacred, incomprehensible, and declared it the true face of divinity. Temples were desecrated, statues torn down, priests replaced by dancers, sacrifices offered to a rock wrapped in gold, and Elagabalus, child of chaos, dressed in veils and pearls, marrying men in public, placing himself as both bride and groom in weddings no law could recognize. Rome was not kind to what it did not understand, and Elagabalus understood little of Rome. He ruled not with law, but with instinct. And instinct, when unchecked, feeds on the absurd. He released snakes into crowds for amusement. He dined on nightingales' tongues and forced nobles to eat until they vomited, only to begin again. His banquets were labyrinths of pleasure and discomfort. His court a circus of mirrored faces and painted skin. In private, he whispered to the stars. In public, he danced before the people, demanding they see him as holy. And yet, beneath the jewelry and perfume, lay fear raw, untamed fear, the fear of being forgotten. When the guards finally turned, they did not hesitate. He was dragged from his chamber, still dressed in embroidered robes. His body was thrown into the Tiber, as if the water could cleanse what fire could not. And Rome exhaled again. His name was Caracalla. Though history rarely says it with warmth, he wore it like armor, jagged and unpolished, more fitting for a soldier than a sovereign, son of Septimius Severus, raised on campaigns and cold strategy. Caracalla inherited not a throne, but a battlefield disguised as a government. He shared the crown at first with his brother, Geta, a gesture of unity forged in public and poisoned in private. Rome cheered the heirs of the Severan line, watching them parade through the streets with rehearsed harmony, but behind palace walls, there was no harmony, only hatred. They avoided each other's gaze, assigned separate guards, spoke through closed doors. Their mother, Julia Domna, tried to stitch peace between them. But Rome had taught her sons one unshakable lesson, that power could not be shared. One winter evening, Caracalla asked his brother to meet in their mother's quarters, a gesture of peace, of reconciliation. And when Geta entered, unarmed and uncertain, Caracalla's men fell upon him with daggers. Blood stained the walls. Julia screamed and wept as her second son bled across her feet. Caracalla emerged with cold breath and no apology. Rome was his, alone. He declared his brother a traitor, erased his name from records, ordered statues smashed, paintings scraped, coins melted. Anyone who mourned was accused. Thousands died. The Senate trembled. The people watched in silence. But Caracalla was not done. He looked beyond the Tiber, to the edges of empire, and saw a different threat obscurity. He wanted to be remembered, not just as emperor, but as a second Alexander. So he gave Roman citizenship to every free man in the empire, a generous gesture on the surface, but beneath it lay greed. More citizens meant more taxes, and more taxes meant more soldiers. He marched east, across the sands of Mesopotamia, declaring war on shadows, erecting statues of himself as a warrior king. He believed conquest would heal what fratricide had wounded. But glory did not come. Only resentment, only ghosts. In every village he passed. Children whispered the name of Geta in every battle. The banners grew heavier. The crown, too. By the time he reached the shrine of Alexander in Egypt, Caracalla was more myth than man wrapped in lion skins, offering prayers not to gods, but to greatness itself. He tried to become what he admired, but he lacked the charm, the mind, the poetry. He had only the sword, and so he wielded it against generals, against civilians, against whispers, until finally, it turned on him, a soldier, dismissed unfairly, waited by the roadside near Carhae. Caracalla had stopped to relieve himself, alone, casual, as if the world feared him too much to strike. The dagger pierced quickly. The emperor gasped, fell, and was left in the dirt. No theater, no procession, no mourners, just dust and the echo of a name carved with more fear than love. But his death did not free Rome. It merely shifted the weight of madness once more from one crown to another. Because Rome had grown accustomed to the strange, the cruel, the broken, it did not long for order anymore. It longed for sensation. And sensation would always find new masks. They no longer came from noble lines. By the time the 3rd century uncoiled its cracked banners across the empire, emperors were no longer born, they were made. On battlefields, in tents, with mud on their boots and daggers never far from their belts. The Senate became irrelevant, the people voiceless, the gods silent. All that remained was the army, and the army wanted only strength, or at least, the performance of it. Into this broken rhythm stepped Maximinus Thrax, a giant of a man, more beast than emperor, with hands that crushed wine cups and a face carved by the hard winds of Thrace. He had never set foot in the Senate. He had never worn a toga. He was a soldier, lifted by his men, crowned far from Rome, and feared more for his frame than his mind. He taxed without mercy, burned villages for loyalty, and saw every whisper as treason. He ruled with such brutality that even the legions grew wary. Eventually, they turned on him. His own men cut off his head and sent it back to Rome. But Rome no longer wept for emperors. It barely remembered their names in less than 50 years. More than 20 emperors would rise and fall. Some reigned for years, others for days. They died in alleys, in baths, in battle, in betrayal. They were declared gods in one breath and condemned as tyrants in the next, and among this carousel of blood. One name spun longer than most, Diocletian. He was not mad, not in the usual way. He was methodical, cold, detached like a surgeon who does not mourn the patient, only counts the stitches. He split the empire in 2 east and west, naming co-emperors, creating a bureaucracy meant to survive instability. But no system survives forever, even order. When stretched, begins to fray, and beneath his reforms, another madness stirred. Not personal, religious. Diocletian feared what he could not control. The Christians had returned, stronger, bolder, defiant. They refused sacrifice, refused temples, refused the emperor's image, and so Diocletian tried to erase them. Not with one decree, but hundreds. Churches were burned, scriptures seized, bodies tortured, blood soaked the sand. It was not the madness of performance or delusion, but of policy, of calculated fear. And yet, the more he struck, the more they sang, the more he silenced, the louder they became. Rome could not understand this faith, not one born of power, but of suffering. Diocletian abdicated in the end, voluntarily, a rare act. He retired to a palace on the Adriatic Sea, where he tended gardens and watched the world he had tried to control slip into chaos again. And into that chaos rose one final face, one final fire. The name that rose next would not be forgotten. Constantine, not born into madness, not crowned in chaos, but shaped by a century of it. He came not as a conqueror of cities, but of symbols. He looked at Rome fractured, exhausted, disillusioned, and saw not just an empire of men, but a war between gods. The old gods were crumbling. Their temples echoed with emptiness. Their priests whispered to empty skies, and beneath their altars, in catacombs and alleys, a new fire had taken root, Christianity, not of senators and generals, but of the poor, the broken, the invisible. Constantine did not fear it. He saw its use, and one night, before battle, he claimed to see a vision, a cross of light in the sky, bearing the words in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, "You shall conquer." The next morning, his soldiers marched with that symbol on their shields. They won, and the empire was never the same again. He legalized Christianity, funded churches, held councils, baptized himself, and in doing so, turned the throne of Rome into a pulpit. But Constantine was not a saint. He was still an emperor. He killed his son, his wife, his enemies. He ruled not by gospel, but by sword, balancing holiness with hunger, peace with politics. He founded a new capital, Constantinople, a city of gold and domes, facing east, facing future. Rome, the old Rome, became a relic, a shadow, a whisper in marble. And yet, the madness did not die. It changed masks. It dressed in robes. It quoted scripture. It spoke in Latin and Greek and silence. Because in the end, the madness of Rome was never just in its emperors. It was in the idea that one man could hold the world, command the will of millions, shape truth itself with a gesture. That kind of power, no matter how pure the beginning, always distorts, always cracks. And yet, we remember them. We build stories around them, not just because they ruled, but because they burned so brightly even when what they lit on fire was the very world they swore to protect. The madmen of Rome were not accidents. They were reflections of what power does, of what fear allows, of what memory preserves, long after logic fades. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, and the whispers of Rome slip into dreams, know this in the quiet. Between sleep and thought, the empire still speaks. Its madness is no longer on a throne. It lives in story, in echo, in you.